Okay, I'm going to start us so that we can say we started on time, but we'll let people trickle in slowly. So, good afternoon or good morning. I see some names for whom it's definitely morning where you guys are. My name is Bojan First. I'm Manager of Knowledge Mobilization with the Leslie Harris Center of Regional Policy and Development at Memorial University of Newfoundland. And given our panelists today, I think we are going to have a really fun discussion. But before I introduce them and before we get to actually what we are going to talk about, allow me to acknowledge the lands on which Memorial University campuses are situated. Those lands are in the traditional territories of diverse indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. And we encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this morning and to consider the indigenous people for whom these lands are traditional territory. We are going to do two things today. The first part of this session will be the launch of Exit Zero project. And if I'm not wrong, you can visit that project website at exitzeroproject.ca. This is a public online archive of more than 3 decades. Greg, I'm dating you here. More than 3 decades of photographs, videos, and stories about Newfoundlanders and Labradorians leaving this province, leaving home in search of work. The project was funded through the Office of Public Engagement Accelerator Fund here at Memorial University. And I had the pleasure of getting Barb and Greg together to make that project happen. Greg Locke is the main author of the project, whose archive is now public. He is a photojournalist and a documentary photographer who has worked in Africa, Europe, and across Canada, photographing historic moments such as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, among many, many other events. And in the interest of full disclosure, Greg is also a good friend. Dr. Barb Neese, who's going to be our second panelist, had an illustrious career as a sociologist, and there are not many people whose careers I would describe that way. She is a member of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And for the past decade or so, Dr. Neese and her team have been studying the effects of long-distance commuting on workers, families, and communities across the country. So once we talk to Barb and Greg about their project, we are going to invite 2 more panelists, and we'll have a conversation about the relationship between journalists and researchers. What are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the strengths? And how we can make this work for everybody a little bit better. The 2 people who are going to join us is Ashley Fitzpatrick, a Newfoundland journalist whose work on energy sector and many other crucial issues is indispensable for an informed and useful conversation in this province. She has been a guest on Harris Center panels quite a few times. We have asked her to moderate a few of those, and we have worked with her on some of the other projects that we have here at the center. Some of you will also recognize the voice of Maureen Anundsen. She's a broadcast journalist, and for a relatively short period of time, for about a year, she has been the host of Fisheries Broadcast. During her time at CBC, she also managed CBC partnerships. So she's going to bring some real interesting perspective to this conversation. Today, interestingly enough, she is collaborating with Dr. Barb Neese on one of Barb's ongoing projects. Barb, you always seem to be doing interesting things. So for you in the audience, this is a Zoom webinar. So please use Q&A box to ask any questions. You can ask them at any point in time. I'll keep an eye on it. And we have Dr. Mandy Rauzo in our office who's going to make sure that I don't miss any of the questions. You can also use the chat box. I'll try to ask as many of your questions as I can throughout the conversation, but we'll have a little bit of time at the end for anything that I missed. We are recording this session. I think you all have heard the beginning of that recording. The session will be available later on the Harris Center website and on our YouTube channel. So feel free to rewatch it, share it, and use it. So, Greg and Barb, let's start with you two and the Exit Zero. Greg, it is your work that we see there. Tell us about how it started and how did this whole thing get to be what it is today?
It took many years and I didn't know what I was doing until it happened. So I travel endlessly for my work as a photojournalist. I'm also, would just self-describe as a part of that Newfoundland diaspora who left Newfoundland to look for work. My parents did, my grandparents did. But about the time, around 2006, I ended up doing an assignment in Fort McMurray for the Financial Post magazine, and it was portraits of Newfoundlanders who were working in there, who had moved there. And that was before, that was just before, a couple years before they started doing this this airbusing of people back and forth. People actually went and lived there. There wasn't a whole lot of that commuting back and forth to Newfoundland. So I did that, and that was pretty cool. That got my interest, and then I met so many different waves of immigrants, Newfoundland immigrants to Fort Mac. I met people who were there for 40 years. I met people who were there just that week. I met people who loved it and settled down and stayed. And I met people who hated it and couldn't wait to leave. So I met the whole gamut of that kind of Newfoundland diaspora in Fort Mac. And that's where it got me thinking about, the first thing was I started thinking about, I grew up in Toronto with Portuguese and Italian immigrants, and I begin to see the similarities between the Newfoundland immigrants in Fort Mac culturally. It's like, wow, it's like there was the same traits that were happening to them culturally, and their nostalgia for home and this. And then, of course, that got me thinking about my own family and how they, for generations, have first moved between England and Newfoundland and New York. And then my parents going to Toronto in the 60s, and then me after school going back to Toronto in the 80s. Whoops. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think I lost everything.
We can hear you, we just can't see you.
Okay,
I should probably add that Craig is on assignment in Conn River at the moment.
And well, so you can hear me. I can just finish it up, and then you can talk while I fix my video.
Okay.
So I got to think about all these similarities of migrant workers. It didn't matter really where they were from or these immigrant communities. Once they migrated, their relationship to their culture as it sits now and what they left is very much the same. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And then a year later, I got to spend 6 months working on a documentary film in Grand Prairie in Northern Alberta. And that's what's really solidified the idea then. So once that job was done, I came back and said, well, I'm going to do my own documentary about, the Newfoundland experience of migratory work and immigration. And so we actually went out and shot everything. And in the end, we had all this material and it never got finished. So then I thought, well, let's just gather it all up and let's do a website. We've got years and years of work here. We've got the interviews, we've got the audios, we've got the stills. Let's put it all together and at least just put it on the web. Because one of the things, and again, this goes to the difference between academics and journalism, is that journalism is you go out, you do your story, it goes in the paper on the air, and then it's gone. It's forgotten. It's in the newspaper business, you say it's just fish wrapper the next day. But academics get to do all this wonderful research, and it gets printed and published and becomes books and academic research, and it lives on. And I always thought it was a shame that some of the better journalism work never had that life beyond the news cycle, be it daily or weekly. So now that we have the wonderful internet, we can do that. We can put all this stuff out there for somewhat semi-permanent archiving purposes.
Barb, listening to this and seeing the stuff that Greg so far pulled out of his archives, you've spent almost a decade now looking at long distance commuting. How some of these stories and some of the images that you saw kind of reflect some of the research that you've been doing? How do those two things kind of come together?
Well, I mean, thank you for introducing me to Greg and to this work, boy, and you kind of brought us together, and then we applied for the funding to make this happen. So it's, you know, the conversation, I think, that can happen between the work that Greg was doing and the questions he was exploring in his work, and the immense visual archive that's there, and the other kinds of research that we were doing, some of which included photography and documentary film and so on and so forth. You know, that conversation, I think, is rich and a real opportunity for people to explore when they can move from the reports and the statistics and so on that you can find on our website for the On the Move Partnership. And again, this visual, personal series of stories that are available now through this collection of photos and again, written text that goes with those photos that tells us who these people are and where he met them and why he met them and what we can take away from that. It's really, I think, a rich combination and the depth, the historical depth. That's the other thing in Greg's work. I mean, he just said, you know, this was before they started fly in, fly out, and so on. And that was something we discovered, you know, in our research, was that there was a point where fly in, fly out really started to happen, and why it happened, and the scale of it, and how it worked, and then how it went away again once the oil industry and prices went into decline, and so on and so forth. So it's, you know, I mean, On the Move is about much more than migrant Newfoundlanders. And Greg's story is in part about people who moved. He talks about the diaspora as well as people who went back and forth. But a lot of the work we do is, you know, the interviews are confidential. You know, there is no photograph of the people that we will talk to, and it's a constant frustration of journalists who want us to say, well, tell me who to talk to about X, Y, Z, and we can't do it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really, I think, nice to have this opportunity to, I mean, we did bits of it with Paul Kennedy, because Paul did a series of 5, I think, or was it 7 ideas programs with On the Move. You know, but that's radio. But you know, he did bring individual voices and so on to that work. But it's the visuals that are so spectacular, I think, in Greg's work, that we're hard to come by.
Barb, how would you say your research, when as a researcher, do you focus, and maybe the same thing for you, the same question for you, Greg, just think as a journalist, what do you focus on when you go out to meet with people, when you talk to people? I mean, there seems to be a very different kind of engagement with people as a researcher than you would have as a journalist. What do you look for when you meet people?
You want me to start, or Greg?
Yes, sure. You go first.
Well, the thing is, we don't just go out and talk to people. That's the first problem. We can't even move, right? I mean, we have to develop research proposals. We have to come up with research questions. We have to review the literature. We have to demonstrate that this work hasn't been done before. Then we have to go through complex ethics processes before we can actually go and talk to people, unless it's for deep background. There has to be a formal consent process, quite legalistic in a lot of cases. You know, it might be an anonymous online survey or something like that, which would be simpler, but even that has to go through a complex exercise. So and then it is a question about how do you find people, and we can't necessarily just walk up to people. It's harder and harder to say, well, who do you think we should talk to? Because that's seen as potentially problematic from the point of view of ethics and so on. So it's a completely different process, I think, from, I mean, what Paul Kennedy told me was you put a mic in front of somebody's face and that constitutes consent. Well, that is just a completely different process. The lack of opportunity for spontaneity, except in certain types of research, such as fieldwork, where you can get ethics approval to go into the field. And I think that there is more spontaneity there, but you always have the obligation of, you know, formal informed consent at some level.
Greg?
That's heartbreaking. This is why I never did a master's degree. Yeah, it's interesting. As some of you know, Dr. Elliot Layton died last week, and he and I were good friends, and we traveled through Africa together and had many conversations. So it's interesting that this should come up, because I had a chance to go back and look at some videotape I had of him, and I remember him, and it's so poignant. He said in his early days, he spent as a kind of junior reporter at the Vancouver Sun. He was always loved storytelling and writing. That's what he was interested in. And so he thought journalism was the way. But then he discovered academia, and he realized that he loved the thoroughness and the in-depth of academic research, and everything was studied and it was complete and finished. Whereas journalism didn't do any of that. It just, but he said the joy of journalism was that journalists knew what questions to ask and what was important and what made a good story. And academics don't know that. They gather all the data and it's complete, but they don't, out of all that, they don't know what's important in the public realm. And that comes, then it comes down to the journalist's job is to take all that information, distill it so that the public can understand what that academic did, and why it's important and why it should be paid attention to. So it was an interesting interview that I had there with him on that, and it was so poignant, and rediscovering that was perfect timing for this seminar. Was that difference between the two roles, the two different separate roles of journalism and academics, but how one did one thing better and the other did other thing better, but together it's a superior product together. One does the research, the other one delivers it, basically, much to the chagrin of many academics, I'm sure.
I mean, there are ethics in journalism, right? Trained journalists, there are, I mean, Maureen has just explained, I mean, you can't put material on unless you identify the source, right? I mean, it's not as though there's no ethics in journalism.
Yeah, and consent is literally, here's what we're doing, sign this paper. If you need that, so it's sometimes bureaucracies create their own problems that I've certainly been in situations where I've been told you need to do this and this and this, but because it's our policy. I said, but that would never stand up in a court of law. What you're asking for is not even legal. It's not required by law. So what you're saying is I'm creating something that is above the law, and that's kind of, I mean, I guess you can do whatever you want, but that's kind of really, hobbling the work when it doesn't need to be hobbled in many cases, right? So why would you create a law or, rules that go above what's required by law in the areas of consent and privacy? Don't know why, but I'm sure someone has that answer.
Before I bring Ashley and Maureen into the conversation, I just want to read out loud a comment from Heather Young-Leslie. She said, I'm struck by Greg's envy of academic publishing as having permanence in contrast to journalism that he implies is ephemeral. The fish wrapper metaphor is beautiful. But in academia, we envy journalism for the reach, the way that journalists reach a far wider audience and are often given more credence by the lay public, and can actually sway the public discourse. Rings true?
Yeah, good point.
Ashley, in your work, How do you
gosh,
work
I'm
with
in the hot
research?
seat. Sorry.
You're in the hot seat. So Ashley, you work with us. You work with a lot of researchers. When you work with the researchers, where do you see the value in this research journalism relationship?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just to start off, the project that's happened here, I think people should be aware of how unique that kind of collaboration is. I mean, in the day-to-day, it's not too common that you would see something like this come out. And it's both speaking to the experience involved and you know, the length of Greg's career and all the material that he could bring to the table, but also Dr. Neese and their ability to work together. So I just want to congratulate both of them on that. It's quite something to see this as an effort. Generally speaking, you know, especially in day-to-day news, right now I'm doing magazine work a lot with Atlantic Business Magazine, a few others. You've got a little bit more time for those kind of feature projects when they're magazine projects. In the day-to-day turnaround, you're really kind of scrambling a lot of the time. So the interactions they tend to be very brief, abrupt. There's a very high risk of sort of discomfort if you're not clear and upfront with people as you're working with them. But there's a lot of benefits. I mean, I go to researchers but I also use research materials. You know, it starts with my own understanding. You know, if I'm working on a larger project, I'm going to be reading a lot. I'm going to be taking in a lot of academic papers. I'm going to be reading more generic reports that are provided, say, to a government level, that are aggregated. But I'll also be kind of absorbing through interviews. So I'll get in touch with researchers and have discussions about, okay, you chose to focus in on this particular area. Is there a reason why that was required at this particular time? You know, it's sometimes described within the papers, you know, that we're building on study X, Y, or Z, but it's not always clear as to why this happened at a particular moment. So if I'm trying to adapt that research to something that's happening in the here and now, I'll be looking for that kind of information, right? But in terms of coverage, then, you know, there's the way that it informs me, but then there's also what I would do in the reverse. So I would approach a researcher because I want to do a piece specifically about their research and their results, or I would approach a researcher to discuss an event of the day. So they provide commentary because it relates to their area of expertise. And that tends to be the place where discomfort becomes an issue. And I think that would be really interesting to get into the conversation around that and how we manage that. But yeah, so there's multiple levels at which, you know, we interact as, you know, journalists and researchers, and different reasons as to why. I'm not sure if that answers everything, but I think there's a huge amount. Yeah, I guess ultimately the huge amount of benefit is that what it's really about is public understanding. You know, from my position, what I'm trying to do is take what the researchers are aware of and what's inherent in their understanding. And yes, you know, as Greg said, translate it for a public audience, but also kind of start to examine that nexus of, you know, what is the edge of knowledge for researchers? Where is the research going? You know, where haven't we really explored that issue yet? And that tends to be where the public conversation is. You know, it's where there's not really clear-cut answers to things. And in a lot of cases, particularly at the local and provincial level, that's because it's not been, you know, a study specific to the local area or for a local audience. So there's a lot of that decision around how far do we jump, how much do we translate, what's fair and what's not. And that's a real discussion. And that has to be a real honest discussion between the journalists who are coming into this area of expertise and trying to kind of, you know, bring point A to point B. So
that issue of scale that the journalists work on often and that the researchers sometimes work on. That's really interesting. I want to come back to that. Maureen, I just wanted to give you a chance to tell us a few things. You've been a journalist for a very long time, and now you're working with Barb in a little bit different capacity. What surprised you now that you are inside the research world?
Well, the most striking thing is what Barb already identified, is all of the many checks and balances and the hoops that you have to go through before you can even ask a question or find somebody who's going to engage with a participant. There's so much to do, and the anonymity of it really surprised me as well. I think that was the biggest thing, was the anonymity, because as a journalist, that's That's the thing. You have to have something that is attributed to somebody, or it can't go on the air. You know, that's just such a foundational part of attribution. Is such a foundational part of journalism. So the anonymity, but also the like I said, there's so many checks and balances, peer reviews, the academic research that Barb was talking about, and also the ethics committee, you know, which is a huge deep dive into the rights of the participant, you know, all the things that we kind of in peripherally we think about, but it's not entrenched in the work like it is in the academic research. But you know, I mean, I think that that's really a valuable part for partnerships, because you know, in my work in partnerships at CBC, what you really talk about is the mutual benefit that both parties in the partnership gets. So, for example, a researcher comes up with all this information because you know we're actually after the same stuff. We're after stories. We're after the latest information. We're trying to build on the knowledge that has already been achieved, and we're also where the academic stops in the research. It's when the journalist takes over, where we are disseminating that into the public. So what CBC gets out of a partnership is rock solid content from the active. We know that it's been approved. We know that it's been reviewed. We know that it's standing on research from other sources. We know that it's ethical. We know that it's legal. So we don't have to worry about those kinds of things. So that's what we get, and we get incredible content because a lot of the stuff that's coming out of the research, like I say, it's new information. It's fantastic content. What does CBC give? We give the public awareness of the research. We give the interest. We generate interest into the story, and we have a wide audience. And that's the big thing. Like for CBC, for example, if you had a story from a researcher that had developed something significant or relevant, that would go international. And so, you know, millions and millions of people would be aware of it. Whereas if it just goes into an academic trove or into the library or something, you know, so that's the problem with research, but also it could be a huge benefit with a partnership.
Yeah, and this scale, that the notion of scale that Ashley brought up, that's really interesting. I didn't necessarily think about it in those terms. The journalistic audience can be very local, while the research can be, you know, provincial or global or national in scope. Ashley, when you encounter that, like, how do you bridge that?
Oh gosh, very carefully, I think is probably the right answer. And I think it is probably one of those areas, like I said, that creates maybe the most tension between researchers and journalists, is how do you get from this very specific, very well-defined, very thought out piece of work that has boundaries around it and extend beyond that without sort of violating an ethical or academic perspective. And ultimately, it's a case of sort of feeling out, well, on the journalist's side, you know, what is their area of expertise? How did they come into this project? How firm are those limits? How comfortable have they been in the past? And sort of moving outside of the bounds of, say, their latest academic study and speaking more broadly to issues at large. But also finding ways in which their very specific research becomes applicable to the larger issues. So I remember coming across, there was a Dr. Aaron Ellison who works out of Harvard, the Harvard Forest, and he's an ecologist and studying climate change in terms of systemic changes and tipping points in ecosystems. And having sort of the discussion with him where he was using pitcher plants to do these studies on because of the life cycle of the actual pitcher plant and everything involved in it, and kind of saying, okay, well, but how fair would it be for me to talk about your research and bring it to, say, systems in Newfoundland and Labrador specifically, or, you know, and we really walked through what he was comfortable with, and in terms of fairness, for me to go beyond that, I think that you have to know your limits as a reporter, and you have to know, journalism ultimately is verification. And if you don't have something to back up what you're going to say, if you don't really have anybody to stand behind you and say that I am the source for this information, then you're in an area that I think you should have a lot of red flags going up around you. If you're going to be talking about hurricanes, and how climate change is affecting, then you really need to, read the work of researchers, to speak to researchers who have worked around, storms and hurricanes, and be sure that, the event of the day, as you're saying, yes, this is because of X, Y, or Z, that actually is the case. And it makes your reporting better the more that you can take researchers and that science and inject it and infuse it into the day-to-day reporting. So I think, if there's any kind of big takeaway, I would say that, that public trust piece that everybody talks about so much now, which is really challenged in journalism today, because beyond the CBC, and no offense to Maureen, but beyond the CBC, things are pretty dire, and the CBC, of course, has its own challenges, but particularly at the local level, there's always this struggle to maintain public trust, to say, yes, what we're producing is going to be of value. And ultimately, for me, I think that comes and has to come out of that verification process, being sure of where you are and what you're saying, and always qualifying, so if you have a researcher in a story and have somebody else who takes their research and brings it beyond in a similar fashion. So if you don't do it yourself as the reporter, but if another voice in the story does that, being very clear on what their qualifications are, what their perspectives are, where they may be coming from on it, so that, even if the researcher doesn't respond within the story, they would have the option then to respond outside of it, because they have those details and they have some understanding of where all that's coming from. So I think the very close discussion with the people you're sourcing from and really understanding what you're sourcing from is probably the bottom line there.
Go on, Barb.
I think that was really, both of these interventions have been really interesting. And I think, from my experience, lots of academics don't want to talk to journalists. And the reason for that, and I've had this experience, is that there's the perception that essentially the journalist comes in with the story framed, and they're really just looking for a quotable quote that may take out of context, that feeds the frame that they had already constructed prior to coming to you, right? So that it's where you end up with problems, I think, between journalists and researchers, from the researcher's point of view, is when journalists basically are unwilling to understand nuance and complexity, who want to make leaps, and who in a sense feel like they already have the answers and are just looking for material, right? So that there can be, and that's why a lot of researchers won't talk to journalists, right? They're very reluctant to engage with them. And one of the reasons why we decided to do this panel is that, there's all of this emphasis and money that goes into universities now, where we're supposed to do knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer, and, and on the move did digital stories, and we did, we're always trying to come up with new ways to reach audiences. But there was no kind of explicit invitation, in some sense, to collaborate with journalists who actually have the skills and the training and many of the resources that we might need to do this well. And Maureen, your point about partnerships is, the other thing is that I don't think there is a partnership between Memorial and a journalist organization in this province that I'm aware of. That there are particular collaborations. We just did a documentary with Leanne Morrison, with Angela Antle, that went on Absolutely Canada, and so on and so forth. But there are no partnerships that I'm aware of. And so for me, one of the questions is, why aren't there? I'm certainly seeing them in other universities where researchers are submitting research grant proposals in collaboration with the Toronto Star and newspapers and so on. And I think some of the results are wonderful. And so I'm interested in a conversation about that possibility? And, you know, would it be a good thing? But then how would we make it happen?
Okay,
Maureen, go ahead.
so my experience in partnerships and in journalism would suggest that you need a conduit. You need an established thing. It can't be just an ad hoc thing where journalism calls up Barb News and says, I hear you're doing something on the fish. I need something for the 6 o'clock news. This is what I need. When can you do it? Because that's what usually happens, and that's the experience that you were describing. But if you had a desk, if you had even one person who had some experience in both academia and in journalism, and was an established practice where that person whose job would be to go through the research, talk to all the researchers or most of them or whomever, but have some, not the ones in biology who are doing single cell molecular cell division or whatever of a gnat. That's not going to work for the news. However, stuff that is in the humanities, stuff that is in science, in genetics, in health, in pharmacy, all of the things that are being conducted at the university. And, I'm amazed at how much is actually going on in there that nobody knows about. And I've said many times when I was at CBC, we've got to get into some kind of a relationship with the university. There has to be a conduit between what they're doing and what we're putting on the air. Because if you talk about what Barb Neese herself has done over the years, which has been really relevant and really significant for people's lives. And you're talking about personal experience. She's talking to people with personal experience. She's getting beyond the headline. She's taking a deeper dive in it because of the experience that she has as an academic. So you take a person who's going to be a conduit between the university and CBC, for example. So CBC, you've got the same goal. CBC wants content that is reliable, that is trustworthy, that has already been approved and gone through ethics committee and all of those things. So it's very reliable information. That takes a huge load off the journalist, really a huge load, because it's coming really well established. So you've got the content that you're looking for at CBC, and you've got the audience that is needed by the researcher, especially for the stuff that is really relevant and really topical and that kind of thing. So my opinion would be, you need an established desk of some kind to be the conduit between both areas, and the person should have, I think, journalism experience, because you need to be able to know how to pitch a story. You need to know what is relevant, right? Like Ashley was talking about, and what Greg was talking about. You've got to have a story sense of what's going to work as a journalistic piece as well. But I think that there's a huge future in that, because as resources keep getting limited and limited and limited, you can see from watching the news, you can see from listening to the news, that they just don't have the time to do the research that is required for even the littlest story that they're doing. So you see a real difference in what's being offered. And of course, the competition is severe now with digital news and digital feeds and international feeds and everything else. So, and you take an example from, because of the diversity that's in the university, and you see the diversity that's in, for example, the CBC programming, what I'm talking about, because that's what I'm familiar with. But we have everything from Works and Quarks to Tapestry, so there's a huge array of very significant and detailed programming that would work for individual departments in the university. But you do need that conduit. You do need that steady supply, because you can't just call up a researcher and say, I heard you doing this, because number one, you haven't got as a journalist, you don't have the information that you need. You don't have the background. And as Barb was afraid of, you're just looking for the top layer. You don't want that.
Maureen, I'm so glad you brought this notion of you are getting content that's already been pre-vetted. I just wanted to share a little anecdote, because I see we have time. Some years ago, we organized storytelling workshop aimed at particularly audio storytelling. And we had Chris Brooks here from St. John's and Christina Harnett, who is a CBC producer in Halifax, come and teach here. We had a bunch of newly minted PhDs and PhD students. And it was a 2.5-day workshop. First day, We were talking about what a story is, and we were telling personal stories. It was hilarious. We were laughing, crying. It was a bunch of really born storytellers. It was amazing. The next day, we said, okay, this was great. Everybody gets this concept. Let's talk about your research. And suddenly, this bright, interesting group of people it was like pulling teeth. You could not get anything that even closely resembled a story. So Christina, Chris, and I took a break and we had a conversation. We were trying to figure out what happened. Did we do something wrong? And I think we cracked it. The moment they started talking about the research, researchers felt they had to defend it, because that's what they do in academia. They defend the research. So we really work hard with them on this notion that, look, when we come to talk to you, we already think you're an expert. If down the road we figure out that you completely messed up and you are utterly unethical person, we are going to have that conversation. It's going to be very different and you're not going to like us anymore. But that first time we come to you, you're already an expert. You don't have to prove anything to us. And from that point on, it was a little bit easier. But they could still not get over this fact of having to defend their research, even though nobody was asking them. We were genuinely interested in what they're doing, right? It was a real interesting dynamic.
Well, when you talk about YAFL that you're involved in, that I think the missing link there is the journalism piece, because you've got the research, you've got the community engagement. Where's the public exposure?
We have a few questions.
Sorry, can I just jump in really quickly with a comment on that? Because I don't want to let it go, without putting in a bit of context. And I know this will probably ruffle a few feathers along the way, so that's always good for the questions.
Go for it. That's even better.
But basically, I wanted to, number one, I did have, in terms of what Barb was saying and the possibilities to actually get that moving, I did have the experience of going down and with the Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island, and there's a really interesting program where they pair up scientists and journalists, and you get, it's sort of themed per year, but it's always a very intensive, and it's an off-the-record encounter, which I think is really important. It's the potential for new projects to come about, new links to be created between scientists and journalists, but also a really open discussion about why those misgivings are there and kind of how to get around them. And I will say there's one really interesting project that they do every year, which is they take academic research papers and they make small groups with one scientist and two journalists who are selected. And they have that paper looked at from the scientist's perspective. So they give you sort of a briefing of, okay, if I was reviewing 100 papers today and I needed to scan this for essential information, here's how I would approach it. And here's why I would look at these things. And then they take it from the journalist's perspective and they ask the scientist to try and kind of come out with a story idea from this academic research paper. So it's basically reversing the roles. And then everybody comes together and talks a little bit about what they learned. And those kind of moments, I think, really build some of that trust. And if we did it, if there was a way to do that at the local level, I think that would be brilliant, fantastic. It's educational for the journalists, but I think really important for that relationship and like I said, that trust. And just extending on the idea of capacity. I think if you're wondering why it doesn't happen more often and why there's such an issue here, I think people should really wake up to where Newfoundland and Labrador is in media right now. And Boyan and I have had these discussions many times. I'm working on something, hopefully it'll come out soon relating to this, but we've lost 18 outlets in this province since 2014. I don't know if people have realized, but they're gone, and these are not, at the time they were gone, at the time they killed them, in the last couple of years, some of them had no reporters associated with them. They were literally just a shell, a header on a piece of paper. But those platforms, so those outlets that were distributed all throughout Newfoundland and Labrador had the potential, as companies, as institutions, to be staffed to make connections between local individuals and what their interests are to start linking, the work of scientists and researchers to them at the local level. When we talk about what's happening, or we look at what's happening in Canada and around the world in terms of fake news and disinformation and all of that. And there's a whole lot to talk about there. But ultimately, if you don't have the capacity of people, of journalists, to be that link between, you know, everybody in their day-to-day who don't have time to read all the research papers and the researchers who do nothing but read all the research papers. If you don't have that link, which we do not have, you know, the CBC hasn't filled those voids, you know, like, and I'm sorry, Marie, but that's just the reality. They're not in those communities. There's nobody in the Northern Peninsula. There's nobody, you know, down in Marystown, there's a handful of really great journalists, but their outlet is gone, right? And outside the overpass, outside the overpass, you can count on one hand the people who are actually doing day-to-day reporting in this province, you know, and think about all of the entirety of Memorial University, all of the campuses, all of the topics, all of the people, you know, and what those 5 people would have to translate day-to-day potentially, right? The opportunities are endless, but the capacity to do that kind of work, I think, is important for us to start looking at more in this province.
Can I just say something here about
Maureen, then Barb.
The journalists aren't in those communities, but the researchers are. So that's another aspect of the partnership. If you have a researcher from MUN up in St. Anthony doing research on a fish plant or in a fish plant or about something that's going on in that community, and they have a partnership. And the thing to remember about the partnership too is that it's totally respectful. It's a mutual thing. No one side takes the lead. It has to be, the benefits have to be seen and accepted by both parties before it moves forward.
Okay. Barb, and then I have a question for Greg.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say poor Greg, he's being dominated. But I mean, I think the point I wanted to make, Ashley, is that, I mean, I understand that, I mean, a big issue here is the lack of resources in journalism. And I think we all lose when we don't have the capacity for investigative journalism, and we don't have journalists who are able to specialize in particular areas and do the kind of journalistic work that you've been describing that you in fact do. It's absolutely crucial. And I think, you know, a lot of people have said post-COVID, we can't go back to, well, post-COVID, I think what was striking to me about COVID, in fact, was how journalists and scientists and people in public health and other people worked together, and how critical that whole network was in terms of public education and making a translation of complex questions about immunology, and ultimately, you know, being able to get Canada to where it is in terms of vaccination status and so on and so forth. I mean, that, and, you know, as an academic who is trying to understand COVID and its impacts on mobile workers, you know, the only place I had to go at that point, really, because there was almost nothing published academically, was to journalists. And there was some amazing investigative journalism that was done that played a critical role in our work. So I think my point is that we all lose collectively as scientists and as the public and as journalists if journalism isn't strong and if research isn't strong. And, you know, saying there's an academic, Maureen, just between the two of us, saying that there's a researcher in St. Anthony is not necessarily going to solve your problem at all, right? That researcher in St. Anthony is studying a very specialized thing, right? They can't answer your questions about X, Y, Z. You know, and you know, the part of the problem with academic work is it takes time, right? Whereas journalism has, you know, and I can say, you know, well, you know, this was true in this place at this time when I did this work, and theoretically, and, you know, given other people's work, it might apply there. But journalism, you know, is what's telling us what's happening now, right, in a sense. And it's we need all of that. But what I want to see is there a way for us to provide more mutual support so that we all collectively benefit and, in fact, you know, achieve and maintain public trust, but also do the work that needs to be done that's dealing with the issues that really matter.
Okay, I have a question for Greg. I'm going to read 2 comments, and then I want to get back to that supports thing. So Chris says, One of the qualities I like about photojournalism in particular is that it does not just tell a story, it invites, sometimes demands us to connect to the emotional aspects of that story, and even more broadly to our humanity. This seems antithetical to rigorous, unbiased academic research. Is this a real tension, or am I making a false dichotomy and barrier?
Is that a question for me or just a comment?
It's a question for you, I think.
Okay. He's right. He's absolutely right. So I started out working for wire services where we had 3 deadlines a day. And then I moved to daily newspapers where I had 1 deadline a day. And then I worked to weekly magazines where I had a deadline a week. And that's where I found where I was happiest, was in longer form, longer deadlines, because it gives you a little bit more time to think about what you want to do and execute it. Wire service was just like hammer it out as fast as you can and just keep revising as the day goes through. So it's in that I discovered, and this is how I ended up working with Elliot Layton and other researchers, was like, there are great stories out there and I'd love to go photograph them all and work on them. It's just a matter of finding that nugget that I want to go see and photograph. And once I'm there, I can have all the information I want. If I can't turn that into a visual, I won't get into the psychology of this, but visual stimulation on humans is way more powerful than text. And which is, I think, why being a horrible dyslexic is why I really turned to photojournalism as opposed to writing. I can, he's right, that provides that emotional attachment. But this whole crossover now becomes, there's academic research, there's journalism, and now we're talking about art. Because one of the things, even in photojournalism, you are talking, as a photojournalist, you are using the rules and concepts of visual art, of painters, of illustrators, to create an image that elicits emotion or response from a viewer. So it's the more information you have, the more you have to think about when you craft your images. So my job, it's always said that the best photojournalist, or the best photo, is one that when you put it on the table that you can read that story. So that's not just taking a snap. That means now I have to craft an image using art, like composition rules, of light rules, to color, even color, the choice between color and black and white. I can pull an emotional response from a human being based on the composition that I choose for a photo. And it's that cold cut and reality. Just like a writer chooses how to write. He has a lead, he has a body, he has a conclusion. He chooses his words, he chooses his sentence and paragraphs, he chooses punctuation, because he wants to engage and elicit a response from the reader. Photographers, the good ones anyway, the best ones, can do the same thing with pictures using the same thing. So yeah, and the more information I have, the more information I have from a reporter or a researcher or an expert, the more tools I have that I compare with my skills to tell that story in pictures or video.
Awesome. 2 comments. One is from, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, from Gayashi. He says, as a social researcher from the global South country, where media standards need much improvement, it is always good to see conversations on stronger relationships between journalism and academia. Thank you. Happy we could oblige. The other comment is from Heather, who said, what Ashley says is almost exactly the same for Alberta. We do have post media here, for what it's worth. CBC is only in urban areas. Ashley's point is really, really important. So that local media, it's funny, my first journalism job in Canada was for a news agency, so 3 deadlines a day, in Southern Alberta, that covered Southern Alberta for Calgary and Edmonton metro papers. So when you open Calgary Herald or Edmonton Journal, page 3, I believe, was just regional news. And those of us who work for the agency, we filled those pages, right? That doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of that capacity has actually been gone. And I believe CBC at one point had rural reporters across the country, and they got rid of those, oh my God, in the 90s, I believe. And now when we go do workshops in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, that's something we hear a lot. We hear a lot about local media missing, not knowing what's happening in the community, never mind in the region. And that's going to be hard to fix. Barb, you mentioned this notion of supports and how we could do that. We're kind of trying to do that ad hoc here, so I can match you and Greg because I know you have common interest and there is some funding that we have here that can support those kinds of projects. But interestingly, academic funding council, so 3 of them for social sciences, natural sciences, and health, they actually allow for collaborations between journalists and academic researchers. I am not sure what the barrier is to use that more often. Is it in the way these projects are evaluated? Because a lot of evaluation places emphasis on supporting students. So a lot of the funding actually goes towards that rather than towards knowledge mobilization, partnerships with media organizations. Is that the main problem?
Well, I think we don't have a journalism school. I mean, that's part of it.
That's part of it.
Right. But I mean, if you have a national project like On the Move, you could tap into a journalism school in other places and so on. But part of it is that, I mean, I can't speak for other researchers, but I don't really know enough about journalism. Right? I don't know how those schools work. I don't know, so how do you handle the sort of complex ethical combination of what research that's largely anonymous and confidential and so on, with embedding a journalist in that kind of environment and so on. So it's just, it's having some kind of roadmap. How would these kinds of partnerships work, I think. I've sat on granting council committees that have, embraced these kinds of collaborative partnership proposals with journalism schools and newspapers and other researchers and so on. So I think that there is potential funding there, but I just look at how funding goes, and it's not that I'm not opposed to us training social science students in digital media or in, On the Move produced, I think, some wonderful visual materials like Sharon Roseman's 2 documentaries that came out, which are wonderful, right? But I mean, we are starting from square one, and it might be more effective and more efficient to work with trained journalists in some of that work, for sure. I mean, we worked with Derek Norman, who was in the film industry and came to the university, and I think that provided good expertise. So it's like figuring out a roadmap, but we do have this issue of, given the focus on training, that we don't have a journalism school at Memorial. And so how do we address that? I mean, do we have a journalist in residence program? Let's sit down and figure this out, so that we can really, I think, mutually benefit from this more than we have. At least that's my perception anyway.
Barb, I have a question for everybody that's basically the same question, but since you are the lone researcher with 3 journalists here, I'll let you go first so that they don't gang up on you. What is, when you think about your experience with journalists, what is that ideal experience? What would you like to see happen?
I mean, for us, most of the work with journalists has been kind of add-on, right? So the Paul Kennedy Ideas series, Paul was able to come in, he calls it drive-by journalism, right? So he's able to go into Fort McMurray and in a 3-day field trip, because Sarah Dureau is there and has been doing research there for years and has enormous knowledge and so on. He's able to, in a sense, harvest the work that that she's doing for an ideas program. But it is an ideas program, right? I'm not sure how many people listen to those programs. You know, and then there's the collaboration with Greg and then with Angela Antle for this other documentary. But is there another model, I guess, would be my question. You know, On the Move invested in a lot of equipment, photography equipment, you know, film editing equipment, and so on and so forth. It's not clear to me that it's going to be used extensively. It's expensive. It's soon out of date. You know, does it make sense for us to be spending money on that kind of equipment instead of having teams, you know, and again, having direct collaborations. The work that I've seen in terms of investigative journalism, some of these collaborative projects is outstanding. The journalistic research is outstanding, right? You know, and I don't think that we think of journalists as researchers, right? But I just thought I've seen some really high quality work come out of that, in addition to the knowledge mobilization aspect. We think of journalism as helping people understand our story, but these are people who are actually doing the research.
Mhm. Yeah, for example, in terms of photojournalism, the latest project by Matt Black comes to mind, the American Geography, where he worked with researchers sort of mapping poverty across rural United States, right? So it was a really interesting project. It took 10 years, but it's this dedication that comes with it. The question for three of you, though, is when you think about researchers, what does that ideal relationship look like? Greg, go first. I know you want to.
Well, I've done it. I've done it. And I've done it with really good journalists. I've done it with really good academics. I mean, you know, I spent 3 months in Africa with Elliot Leighton and producing a book. And, you know, at the beginning, it was, you know, it's interesting because I had been working overseas. That was the mid-90s. And I call it Greg's lost years because he was basically spending, you know, 250 to 280 days a year on the road. And when I'd come back, Elliot and I would get together and do things. And he said, well, what are you doing now? And I would tell him. And then the idea of this book came up. And he said, well, how would we do that? And I said, I don't know. You tell me. You're the academic. And I said, for me, I have to go there and see it. That's the thing about being a photographer, you know, or a documentary film producer, is you actually have to be there. You have to go and be there and record it in person. You know, other types of research can be done remotely and over the phone even. So I said, we actually have to go. I said, let's figure out what the story is. We figured out what the story is. And he said, well, how would you do that? And I said, here's the way I would do this. And he told me how he would do it as an academic piece. And I said, cool, this is easy. We just go, here are the people we need to meet. Here's what we need to see. And the one thing we did agree on up front for this, and like every project is unique in its parameters. We agreed that I would do mine and he would do his. And I knew, he didn't know this, but I knew they would parallel. So basically, instead of having one story that was words and pictures, or pictures illustrating his work, we would produce a parallel works, 2 works. We started from the same point and we went that way. And we kind of crisscrossed a few times and met up. But again, I knew this would result in this, is that it was the same story, but just from a visual perception, a visual perspective, and the other from an academic perspective. And, you know, they did complement each other, as opposed one being subservient to the other or one serving the other. That can be different on other stories. That worked out quite well the way it was. But you do need to, the journalist and the researcher need to start from the same point. At the very least, they have to start from the same point and say, here's our objective, here's what we want to achieve, and then each of them will say, well, here's how I need to do this, and here's how I need to do this, and and you can work together, you could work separately. Again, it depends on the subject, really. But, you know, from the journalist point of view, they need to know. They don't necessarily have to do the exact same, even if it doesn't even have to be visual journalism. But the journalist needs to know what the academic knows, at the very least. And the academic needs to understand that what the journalist is going to produce is not an academic piece. It is a journalism piece, which is designed for the general public and to help them, A, it tells a good story, B, help them understand. Journalism is many things. It can be entertainment, it could be hard news, it could be information, it could be educational. And, I think one of the big things that are missing from journalism today is, lots of journalists, they've got to go out and go, okay, here's the story. Let's get a quote for him, get a quote for him. Bang, we're done. We've got both sides of the story. But the journalist's job is more than gathering that. The journalist's job is to tell you why what that person said is important, why that person said is important, and what it means to the viewer. And I think that's a lot what's missing. And that's where the academic research comes in, because it gives it gives the journalist an independent and relatively unbiased base to judge the opinions on. It's the saying in journalism circles is, if someone says the sky is black and someone says it's red, it's not your job to go out and give equal voice to each of them. It's your job to go out and figure out what color is the sky and then tell them why. So. But I think there's so many different types of journalism too, right? There's that daily journalism, there's weekly journalism, and daily journalism doesn't, I don't think, really need to get too deep into academia other than to get those quick hits and opinions and quotes. I mean, really what we're talking about here when it comes to journalism is long form, in-depth, longer pieces that explain a lot more than, he said this, she said that. See you later. Let's go for supper.
Ashley.
Remind me of what the question was again.
The question was what would the ideal relationship look like?
Oh gosh. Okay. The one thing I'll say is that it's not an institute or a department or a comms person coming to me and saying, here's an idea that we have, and like God bless those efforts. It's great sometimes to make those connections, and it can spark ideas. But if you're talking about a real partnership that's going to come to one of those really special pieces that Barb was kind of describing, that I think has to come out of initially I don't want to say it's not a personal connection, but it's maybe a closer relationship with that particular academic or group of academics that you're going to be working with. And by that, I mean, you don't meet them and then on that day immediately jump into the project. It's a meeting and a discussion, and you sort of get a sense of, am I the right person for them? As much as they might have, asked me to come into this, am I really the right fit? Is there another journalist or reporter who can come in here and be more of greater value? And because ultimately, if you barrel down the road of something without that comfort, you're probably going to come to a point where it's a little bit distressing for both parties, I think. So that initial discussion, and it's got to get into where you want things to reach, what your intention is, if there's anything in terms of what you want to communicate or what you're hoping to come out of it. You want to be really clear. For me, if I was going to get into a project, it would be the kind of thing where a researcher knows that they're about to, say, embark on the research that will ultimately lead to an academic paper that they know will expand on something that's regularly returning to the news. So, for instance, if it's something, relating to the seal hunt, and you're an economist who's going to look into, X, Y, or Z, and you are going to be doing pieces of work over a period of time that will ultimately come to an academic paper, I'd like to be in a perfect partnership with you, kind of through that journey a little bit. And it doesn't mean that I'm there every day or you're telling me absolutely everything that's coming out of it, but just to get a sense maybe of the process as much as the result. And then, to have somebody who's willing to help you in kind of understanding all of what might come around that. But the partnership, I think, going in has to be, as Greg said, it's got to be an understand. Well, everything is going to be different. Like Greg said, it's going to be individual to each partnership. And I think that there has to be an understanding from the start of how those two journeys are going to differ, and sort of the end point as well. One of the hesitations for journalists on our side, I know that for academics, it's this idea of misrepresentation and being taken out of context and having things just, go completely off the rails from the public understanding perspective. But from the journalist side, that idea of final approval, right? So that's a really difficult thing to kind of discuss or get into. But, journalists are not going to want to have academics having a final sign off on whatever that final piece is. And like I said, every project is different, and the degree to which you have a view of that, final element or the outcome of the project is going to be something you really want to hammer down ahead of time. And even the relationship, if it's a case where, a large report comes out, are we going to continue this relationship beyond that in terms of discussing the project, for instance, or would you want to, as the academic, take the lead and make it more of an academic framing in the public discussion of the project? Would we, if you're continuing that research, want to connect down the road, would that be part of the plan of whatever we're doing? But I think mostly, for me, it really does come down to maybe a bit more of a discussion and personal connection, but that connection and that sense of it being something that I know will provide value to the public in the sense that it's a recurring topic is probably a big one for me.
Maureen, as kind of straddling both worlds at the moment, what's that ideal relationship like?
Well, it's so multi-layered because there are different ways that you want to interact with academics for different stories. For example, if you were in a lockup of a budget all day long and oh my gosh, I've got to get this on the news tonight, I need a quick hit, I'm going to call Wade Locklear, somebody from the university who I know has done a lot of research, is very, or if there was something going on and something about a crab processing plant and it was something about crab asthma, I know Brad has already done a lot of work on that. That's who I'm going to go for that quick hit. So that's one layer, that's one level of the relationship that you're going to have with a journalist and between a journalist and an academic that would be ongoing and that you would want to foster and develop and keep it going, because it's interesting for them to be able to show that they have an expertise and get on the air and it's so valuable to the public that they know that this is coming from not a politician, not a journalist doesn't have the depth, but also somebody who's actually really knowledgeable. So that could be a 30-second clip in a news report. Alternatively, if you were doing something, there was something new from a research, if somebody called me and said, I just found this really interesting information, sometimes it's huge and voluminous. And so what you want to do would be almost like, Michelangelo with a big piece of marble, and you have, as a journalist, you have to just keep chipping and chipping away until you find the nugget within. That would be the newsworthy part of it. Sometimes there will be maybe a discrepancy between what the academic thinks is newsworthy and what the journalist knows is newsworthy. So that's another thing, and could be a television report. So it just depends. Like CBC is so, has so many platforms from which we work. From the quick hit of 30 seconds to the long form documentary and ideas that Barb was talking about. So I agree, that some of the biggest losses that we've had in the last 20 years, say, has been like Ashley was saying, the loss of local news has been, catastrophic, really, and also with investigative reporting. People, I don't know if it's coming from the public or if it's coming from the journalist because of the lack of resource, but there's some kind of symbiotic relationship where if something is longer now than 4 paragraphs, I just want the top story, I just want the top line, or I just want the headline or whatever. I don't know if we're just being inundated, but people's appetite for the longer form documentary is not there like it used to be, and people don't the people's habits of consuming news and information. It's changed dramatically over the years. So that also has to be taken into consideration when you're trying to figure out what is the best way for consumers to actually get this information. What is the best delivery for that? Because people don't make appointment viewing anymore. We've known that about television news for a long time. The first thing you do is you put it on Twitter. It's immediate, it's Twitter. So what do you have? How many characters are you allowed for Twitter? So, it's all that condensing. If you have the time and the aptitude to sit down and enjoy a 1 hour documentary on Fifth Estate or something like that, then that's about as appointment viewing as you're going to get. Television news has really gone down the tubes in a lot of ways that way. So it really depends. Number one, the relationship, how you want the relationship, how the relationship is going to be translated into a platform is the most important thing. Going from Twitter to quick hit for the news or to a longer form, you have to establish that. You have to come to an agreement of what the story really is, and that has to be, there has to be a lot of respect there.
Okay, we are almost at the end, but I have two questions, and both of them are complicated. Question for Maureen from Heather. What do you think of the Conversation Canada, which is intended to be the conduit between the university researchers and the public? And what about things like ideas? Their From the Trenches program was wonderful, but is it good enough? Too esoteric?
Is it, what does she mean? Is it good enough? Is it good enough as a program, or is it good enough as content?
I'm wondering, I think she meant whether it's good enough as an example of researchers and media working together.
Well, ideas I think has been the greatest source of that kind of a relationship. She's talking about the CBC program ideas, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think that has been the most receptive to academic research. And I think that the beauty in that is that they do have the time that academics need and have come to expect in getting their information together. And they have the journalists and the producers who are knowledgeable about the pace, the timing, the relevance, the significance, and that kind of thing. So I think that it's the longer form documentary works really, really well in this partnership, extremely well, because academics, they've taken a real deep dive into the content. They know what, and it really for them, it's like getting it down to an hour. There's so much to choose from, and sometimes it's like Barb's example. They go multi hours. Sometimes you've got a series for 5 hours, one hour a night. So it's a platform that is very flexible, and it's a platform that works really well. And the academic person, the researcher, has a lot of say in the content, a lot of say. Pretty well drives the content, and the producers just put it in a form that is suitable for that particular platform. Makes it interesting. The journalists can put it in language too that is more receptive, more appropriate for the form.
Anybody else wants to say anything about the Conversation Canada, Barb?
Well, I'm interested in journalist perspectives on the conversation, because I can see that, for example, Salwar Press is using the conversation frequently. They will republish things that have been published there. I think, and I read material from the conversation. I think it's quite an interesting initiative in the sense that it encourages academics to respond to topical issues using their expertise in a format that is relatively short and accessible. But I don't know how, so it's like trying to turn academics into journalists in a sense, but I don't know how it feels on the journalistic side. And again, it fills the pages of the newspapers, but it doesn't necessarily create jobs for journalists.
I'll jump in on that one. Yeah, I think that the conversation is really great for the idea of actually, like you said, getting academics to start to think about, okay, well, how might, and it's not to say it always does. I think that's an important point too, is that we're going to have and always need academics and researchers looking at things that are a little bit away from the public conversation. But for researchers where it may have a connection, start thinking about that and how to translate that. And I think that that's always helpful in however it comes about. I think for the public, the problem with the conversation, and it's probably why some journalists may shy from it. I'm on the fence in a lot of ways, but I think from that public perspective, the problem is it becomes easily dismissive as a point of view piece. So it reads very much almost like in a letter to the editor, right? Where it's somebody coming in who, yes, they know the subject matter and they can communicate about it, which, you know, they've taken that step in science communication and that effort. But will it be absorbed in the same way as a piece that comes from the New York Times, which has this more disconnected, you know, and there's a lot of arguments about that idea of independence, but is presented as coming from a source that's looked at things and tried to weigh it from a public understanding and verification perspective. And by that, I mean, you know, is what this researcher is presenting, are there other researchers maybe that have contradictory views that should be read in tandem with what that one researcher is presenting in the conversation? And 99% of the time, I would say that is the case, that there's, for that full conversation, you know, if you really want to use the title, the full conversation involves more than one person's research and understanding and views, almost no matter what you're talking about. You know, there are very few fields, some very niche areas of lichenology, I think, maybe where there's only, you know, a handful of people doing it in the world and are probably going to trump most other input on it. But you know, even when it's a case where you have, say, multiple researchers, you're also going to have the public response and the policy response, the political response, which may differ from the pure science and research and what that's saying. So, you know, there's all kinds of topics that can come up in relation to that. And the pandemic is a great one. You know, that difference between what the science and policy tells you is the absolute path that we should take if you want to prevent any sort of transmission. You know, you can come out with some very, very hard and harsh restrictions and leave them in place as long as you want. And guess what? You're going to have zero transmission. And a scientist could tell you that. But it's only through the input of people throughout the chain of public conversation, you know, from the individual in a small town, you know, on the South Coast, right through to the chief medical officer of health in Ottawa. Like, that is what you need to give the public something that they can take away and kind of weigh and say, okay, here's where I land in this. You know, it's not that it's 100% the right thing to do in terms of zero transmission, but it's how I feel. You know, it's knowing all of this where I sit. And that's sort of how the democracy works, I guess.
I have one more question from an anonymous attendee. It's longer. I'm going to read it. I suspect Barb and Greg will have something to say about it quickly, but I think one day might be a session on its own. So the question: as an ethnographer, I'm frequently irritated by the legal system that allows journalists to protect their sources, while ethnographers have no legal precedents for protection of our interlocutors, research humans. And we have sad examples of where state structures have used ethnographic information to infiltrate or destabilize or murder. This has created serious ethical challenges: how to protect potentially vulnerable interlocutors while giving people credit for their esoteric or cultural knowledge. These are ongoing discussions in research methods classes, and journalistic practices are reflected in ethnographic research, partly because journalism is more easily understood because it is more familiar at first. I commonly had to answer questions on the theme of what is the difference between journalism and ethnography? How to do anonymity in ethnographic research? So that's that perennial conflict between the anonymity of research and absolute need of journalism to attribute, but kind of turned on its head.
Yeah, but there's one thing that he's misunderstanding is that we do not have a right to protect our sources, and there's lots of journalists have gone to jail because they have refused to turn over sources or papers. And yeah, we do not have any rights when it comes to protecting sources either. So it's just a matter of the courts, how far the courts are going to go to take your stuff. I actually worked on a story once that I knew when it was published there was going to be a knock on my door from the RCMP because I witnessed something, and after that story was edited and went, I destroyed my notes and my photos because I knew if they came and took it, then it was going to be a problem. So that was my way of protecting the sources.
Yeah, and it comes up a lot, actually. I don't think people realize, even in a local context, it's something that when you're in the day-to-day that you'll come across at some point. It came up for us after the Long Harbor dispute, and it wasn't a legal case. It was a case of potential legal action. Sorry, it wasn't a criminal case. It was a case of a potential legal action that was going to be taken on the part of the company in regards to the wildcat strike and basically taking workers to court. And of course, the evidence that they wanted to provide was the names out of notebooks. The pictures that were public were one thing, but there were also pictures that weren't. And we get that knock on the door. That's and it was disseminated to me, so I can't tell you exactly where it came from. That's the one big caveat, but it came to me through my managing editor at the time. It was Carrie Han, and we had to have a discussion with the attorney. And I it's that comment to them that's like, I will burn this. I will delete all of these records before I hand it over. And then it just becomes a case of how much people really want the material or need it in order to make their case. And it's just more of a conversation. But the idea of protection is always there,
Wow, 3 minutes to 3. Thank you. Thank you to 4 of you. This was fantastic. I also want to thank to Mandy Rauzo and Kathy Newhook in our office who make all of this possible on the technical end. Mandy, at the same time, did I forget anything? Did I read everything that came through?
Yes, you did. Perfect.
Okay, for once. I also want to thank all of you who were with us for an hour and a half. This really has seeded a whole bunch of other conversations that we could probably have, and also some ideas that maybe we at the Harris Center could pursue. As I said, this conversation was recorded. It will be available on the Harris Center website. You can always email us. We love hearing about what it is that you would like to hear about next. And you can also find me on Twitter, and feel free to send those ideas my way that way as well. So thank you. Have a great rest of the Friday and great weekend, and hope you enjoy this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye from Conn River.
Bye, Greg.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.